we're dynamic human beings. We're all a little bit of everything. But 73% of professional salespeople today struggle with a non-supportive buy cycle. So they are more susceptible to people who want to kick the tires, who want to think it over, who want to have the best price. And because they buy that way, they won't push back. They won't ask the questions. And they also won't ask the questions that help their buyers to answer their own questions about how to make this decision.
Introducing Checkwriters, a video podcast for people who want to help their employees, colleagues, and organizations flourish and succeed. I'm your host, Dakota Hebert, Chief Marketing Officer at Checkwriters. Along with my co-host, HR Manager Felicia Corbeil, we'll hear from business leaders and pros who share captivating stories from their respective industries. Join us as we uncover their strategies and get unique inspiration for building great processes and experiences at your own organization. Check out and subscribe to Checkwriters on Apple, YouTube, or wherever you listen and watch your favorite shows. Thanks for watching. Think about the last time you bought a car. Did you kick the tires, so to speak? Hem and haw about price? Did you go to multiple dealers and play one off the other? Or maybe decide not to buy one at all? Carole Mahoney, Harvard sales coach, HubSpot INBOUND speaker, and author of the book Buyer First, and our guest today, would say how you buy is how you sell. This is just one of the neuroscientific narratives that informs her sales philosophy. Buyer First is chock full of business stories, sales secrets, and management strategies for HR, owners, and anyone in sales, which is everyone. Listen to this episode of Checkwriters and learn how to onboard new sales reps so they're primed for success, strategies to make your recruiting, hiring, and sales efforts more effective using dopamine, and how HR can improve the dreaded performance improvement plan. Carole, thank you so much for joining us on the Checkwriters podcast today. A lot of your sales philosophy seems to be based on a confrontation that you said you had with yourself.
Yeah.
And the fact that you had to confront a bad perception that you had of sales.
Mm-hmm.
So tell us, what was the bad perception of sales and how did you ultimately kind of work yourself up to confront it?
And I think that's the decision that we all have to make at some point in our lives, whether you're in sales role or you're a business owner deciding to whether hire or fire someone. If you're an employee and you're trying to pitch your ideas or to get that promotion, and you have to make the decision, is this in the best interest of the person who I'm going to be, as I heard you say in a recent podcast, sitting next to every single day, talking to every day as a customer, having someone who's on my support team have to deal with whatever issues or promises that I made in a conversation that they now have to figure out a way how to fulfill. It's something that we all have to make a decision on whenever we're trying to solve problems with people. We either tell them what we think we want them to hear, or we tell them the honest truth of what we think is in their best interest.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a small mindset shift that is so incredibly powerful, which is why I called the book Buyer First.
That's actually a great segue into our next question, because the book is called Buyer First. And the title Buyer First and the idea and the philosophy it's very simple because people would think, oh, of course, like, why wouldn't I put the buyer first? However, we don't. and it's almost like human nature. I think you talk a little bit about, too, the fact that we get a dopamine hit when we're talking about ourselves or we're putting ourselves first, just like certain aspects of our nature. But talk a little bit about your sales philosophy, because what do you mean? What comes behind Buyer First? That simple message, but how did you develop it and what does it mean?
So for me, Buyer First means that you're looking to understand your buyer. Listen to understand their perspective on things first, because what they think matters more than what you think at the end of the day. And putting our buyers first in the questions that we ask and the intent behind those questions. Are we asking questions to get the information that we want so that we can leverage that against them to convince them to buy from us later? Or are we asking these questions so that we can truly understand, is our solution the right fit for them, where they're at now and where they want to go? Is their culture and our culture a right fit? Is their mission and values a right fit for us? And how do I help them to see their problem in a way that maybe they hadn't seen it before? Because a lot of times I think we have buyers who come to us and they want a solution for something that they've tried over and over again. And it's like Einstein's definition of insanity. You're trying to fix a problem the same way over and over again. And we have to put their interests first, not only in what they want, but what it is that they actually need. And it's really more about the intention of the things that we're doing. Because we can take any of the techniques that I wrote in that book to try to manipulate people. to try to push them into doing things that we want them to do. But our buyers today are way too smart for a lot of that. It's like they can sense it coming, like they can smell the scent of desperation in the air somehow when these things are happening and something's just not sitting right with them. But also, what happens is that when we're not putting our buyers first and we're asking our questions, what we're not able to do is answer the questions that our buyers have. It's the reason why so many deals come to no decision or get lost to a competitor is because we haven't done a good job of helping our buyers answer their own questions about, is this a problem I need to solve? And how is the best way to solve it? And what kind of solution is the best idea? Is it outsourced? Is it insourced? Do we develop it ourselves? Do we get off the shelf or customized? And then why is this person the best person to actually implement this solution for us? These are the questions that we're not answering in our sales conversations because the intent is about us getting the sale, no about them solving their problem.
Yeah, as you're describing that, I mean, I'm sure you've been in these types of sales meetings and demos too, but
Mhm.
you're thinking like, I haven't been able to say one thing, and the salesperson will literally be describing something that you would never use or not interested in.
And they
So
don't know because they haven't asked.
yeah,
Mhm.
exactly. But so what sort of exercises do you do with your clients and people you've worked with and successful people that you've worked with to remedy this? Because as we've been saying, it's human nature a lot of time. And we can't just say, oh, I'll put the buyer first. Okay, I got it. I'll do that. You really need to work at it and make a conscious decision to fight that internal desire to make it about yourself, especially
Mhm.
when you think, I got to sell this.
Yeah, and there's things that you can do both as an organization and as an individual, but I'm gonna start with the organization because just as a little preview, the next 2 books are gonna be about the organization
Mhm.
because it's kind of like trying to lose weight and you're surrounded by cakes and cookie and, people who are eating pizza every day. It's gonna be very hard for you to stay on track to be buyer first, to stay healthy, right? And so as organizations, we need to make sure that we're putting the right people who are being set up for success in sales. I'll give you just a horror story example. There is a lot of sales leaders who I have talked to when I ask them about how they set quotas, they set these unrealistic expectations for a quota, knowing that the majority of the team isn't going to be able to make it, but they don't care. As long as this percentage of people do, that's fine. The rest of them we can just replace. They just kind of shrug their shoulders as, this is how we need to do it. And it doesn't take into account the kind of mental health issues that causes, the morale issues that causes within the team, which then causes the very sales problems that they then try to solve for. They bring me in to solve these sales problems, and I often go inside of the organization and find that there are culture issues. There are, other toxic types of issues that are causing these very same problems. And starting with who are this making sure that the person who's writing the role for the description of the job understands that sales job. What is the criteria for success? And like when I'm going through a hiring process with a team, one of the first things that we do is we go through at least 34 or so questions to understand the type of sale, who they're selling to, who's the buyer themselves that they have to talk to every day, and what are the price points? What's the marketplace like? How competitive is it? What kind of pressures are they going to be under? How are they going to be managed? And, what kind of skills are going to be necessary for them to succeed in this role? And then with that, creating a profile for the salesperson so that we're looking for and attracting and recruiting in our job descriptions, in the ads that we write, to attract the right person who's going to align with our buyer. And I think what happens is that this is a step that gets skipped over because a lot of times the people who write the job descriptions maybe they've never been in sales or they don't understand the role or they don't understand the buyer. And hiring for salespeople is different than any other role that you're going to hire for. Because unlike most jobs where the employee is supported in all ways to get the job done, salespeople are fought against at every single step by their buyers. Their buyers are not rooting for them to succeed. To support people's buyers and customers are rooting for them to succeed to give me the answer that I need for this problem. And I'm going to give you all of the information that you need to do. Buyers don't act that way with salespeople. So
That's
it's a
true.
different environment. So hiring for salespeople needs to be different. It's not to say that you do have a different candidate experience. It's just that you have to consider the environment that they're going into. So I think that's number one. And, I use data and I use assessments to reduce the unconscious bias that people have. Like sales, I was sitting next to someone on a plane yesterday, wonderful gentleman. And his perspective on hiring salespeople is that you have to have the personality and either you've got it or you don't got it. My perspective is that it isn't about personality. It's about mindset. It's about skill set. It's about intention. It's about willingness to learn and change and put others first. And that sales is something anyone can learn. And so I think that's number one, is making sure that we have the right salespeople to align with our buyers. And I'll just say this too on the diversity front. Like, so many companies or buyers are looking for individual salespeople and teams of salespeople who can help them to come up with new ideas. This is research that's in the book that came out of Santa Clara University, where sales people who are valued by buyers are the ones that can add new ideas, new perspectives, and new insights into the problems that they have. But if you have a whole bunch of the same type of people and the same type of thinking, like if there's a whole bunch of Dakotas here,
Mhm.
then we're not going to get that diversity of thought that our buyers are demanding to help them understand their issues from a different perspective. And so by using the assessments and having a structured hiring process in sales that's measured, that's graded to reduce that unconscious bias so that we have more diversity, so that we can offer these insights to our buyers. And so there's a lot of ways in how we hire, how to make that buyer first so that we can set up the environments and culture that make it easier for salespeople to do that. And I think the other thing that we need to do is, as individual salespeople, now that you're in that role, is to first understand everything you can about your buyer and their world. I do a lot of work with Mark Roberge at Harvard Business School, and we first met when he was at HubSpot. And one of the things that I loved that he did was that when he did onboarding for the new salespeople, he immersed them in the buyer's world, had them using the software to try to complete the tasks that their customers were going to have to do every day, had them have conversations with those customers, to sit in and understand this is the person you're selling to. This isn't just a sale. This is a small business owner who's trying to figure out how to feed their families, and they're struggling at night trying to figure out how to change something on their website. Like, that gives you a sense of empathy to be able to understand your buyer's perspectives. And I think the other thing that we need to do to make sure that our salespeople and ourselves are putting our buyers first is we need to check ourselves at the gates, meaning understanding what are the mindsets that are pervading in our own minds about our perceptions of sales. I talk about the sales origin story in the book, like understanding how your own perception of sales might cause you to act in certain ways.
Mhm.
But then even in specific ways, like when we're evaluating salespeople, we're looking for specific mindsets that might get in their way. The need for approval, for example. I was talking about this with the driver when we were on the way here. So, Tim, if you're listening later on, this one's for you. Thank you for the idea. But as we were talking, he was talking about how, most people today, they don't trust the people who just say yes to everything, that they're just telling you what they want to hear. We don't trust those people because they don't care enough about us to tell us the hard truths, right? And we trust people who will be willing to tell us the hard truth because even if you don't like me afterwards, at least I know that I've given you the heads up. And so being able to manage our own need for approval, very human aspect, not only allows us to tell the hard truth and ask the hard questions, but also to ask for an introduction to that decision maker so that we can truly understand what's going to help the organization to solve this particular problem. Understanding how even our own emotional involvement and excitement gets in the way of us being able to actively listen to our buyers. We're listening for the next response that we need to make so that we can appeal to and get them to get away from that objection of price, or that they need to shop it around. Or maybe we've heard that, oh my God, they're so excited about this. And I've had salespeople tell me they're already cashing their commission checks in their head when they start to hear buying signals.
Right.
Like, this is the typical sales kind of response. And so these are the things that get in our way of putting our buyers first in our sales conversations and the
Mhm.
intentions. And then dedicating ourselves to learning the craft and the art of sales, how to have the conversation in a way where you're not making it all about you, and you're not just asking the questions so that you can get to the next point on your checklist and your spreadsheet and your script, and truly being present with that buyer to understand and make recommendations to them, and always, looking to up level your craft. I was over the last 3 days sitting with a group of about 100 or so. Like, these are the top sales world's experts and trainers that are using data and science to help sales teams. And I'm looking around, and some of them have been doing this for longer than I have. Like, they've been doing this before I was even born, kind of thing. And I'm looking around, and they're all taking notes. Most of them. They're taking notes still. Like, they've been doing this for however long, and they're still learning.
Yeah, that's awesome.
And so that's what we need in sales.
Uh-huh.
So, one thing I was thinking about as you were talking is with people in sales, how you kind of mentioned sometimes some salespeople kind of jump the gun a little bit. They think that they've got the sale, they've got it in
Mhm.
their, and they're cashing that check before they even have a yes or a next meeting date. So, one thing that I've found that sometimes happens in HR and sales and the kind of that crossover is we have salespeople who end up on a performance improvement plan
Mhm.
because they're not hitting their quotas. Maybe they're, drastically behind, like you mentioned, those people who get very far behind the quota. How do we help them? Especially, how can managers, leaders, HR managers, how can we help those people who get in that predicament?
I've had this situation happen so many times. And I'll tell you first what not to do, because what happens is we put a salesperson on a PIP, right? A performance improvement plan. And we're already having a mental impact on them because, what's the first thing that comes to mind when someone tells you that you're failing?
That they're failing. They're
Right.
going to lose their
They're
job.
going to lose
Yes.
their
Yeah.
job, or, how are they going to feed their family? You need to get your what together. If you don't get your what together, then, all of these horrible things are going to happen. And what's happening is they're now getting emotionally involved. They're now scrambling and they're talking to themselves in their head. It's as soon as you mention the word performance improvement plan, they didn't hear anything you said after that. They're not going to hear anything else that you say after that because all they can think is, how am I going to get this done? And they're scrambling in their minds. They're getting more desperate on their phone calls. They're doing a lot more of the talking now on their phone calls. They're pitching even harder. They're calling even more. They're spamming even more people because they're just doing more of the same. And what we need to do is, before we know that someone needs to go on a performance improvement plan, is that we need to, one, and this is book number 2, y'all, we need to have a regular coaching cadence where we're not just talking to them when something's going wrong. One of the questions that I often ask organizations who are having a hard time hiring the right salespeople. I heard this question, and I forget who it was that said it at the conference, but you have to ask yourself the question, did you hire them that way or did you make them that way? And it's a hard question to answer when you're the hiring manager or the business owner, because that means you have to do some internal looking into and seeing if this is something that we've caused, or is this something in the way that we've hired this person? Maybe this is not the right role for them. Maybe we're asking them to do things that they're never going to be
You're
comfortable
saying
with.
maybe they hired the wrong person in the first place?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And then, so let's say that we believe we've hired the right person. And have we given them the resources that they need? Have we set up those regular coaching cadences where it's not just a pipeline check-in? When is this going to close? What are we going to do to get this across the line? How much of a discount do you think we need to give? It's, how do we get to this decision maker? What are the pieces of value that we need to offer our champion, and the conversation that we need to have there, the tough questions that we need to ask in order to see if we can get to that decision maker to answer those questions so that we have an appropriate scope of work that's going to solve the real problem, not just the problem that this person thinks it's this and that person thinks it's that. Who is the person who's going to have to make this decision? What do they think that problem is? What do they think that solution is? And instead of coaching them on the conversations and looking at the behaviors that are going to lead to the outcomes, we put someone on a plan and we focus on the outcomes. We don't focus on the behaviors that are going to lead to those outcomes. And this is one of the things that I will also say, and this is the simplest fix for so many people who go on plan, is to understand what's their personally meaningful goal. I'm sorry, y'all, but getting up in the morning and excited to meet your quota is like being excited to pay your bills and your student loans and your
Yeah.
taxes. It's just not what's going to put our feet in the
That's
floor
a good
excited to
I've
start.
never heard it put like that, but that's true.
Yeah.
Yeah, but we expect salespeople to be very excited about that quota.
No. And here's the interesting thing is that salespeople who have a personally meaningful goal that they've identified and they've written it down and they have created action commitments on what are the behaviors that I need to master in order to do that. And then share that with someone, whether that's their manager or someone in their family, other outside sources. I call it creating your support system of people that you're going to share that with, and then make regular reports to them. The data from over 2.2 million sales professionals says that those who go through this exercise are 298% more likely to be top salespeople. 298%. And the reason is because when we get someone on a plan, right, the thing that happens in psychology is called cognitive dissonance. It's this gap between, this is the belief I have myself of being a good salesperson, and here's the reality, I'm now on a performance improvement plan. And if we haven't identified a personally meaningful goal, and it's not your quota, of how we're going to bridge that gap. If we don't have that, we're more likely to make the excuses. It's the economy. Our competition is too tough. I haven't got the right training in place. Maybe I'm not the right person for this role. And we make excuses because we can't sit in that uncomfortable feeling of our own skin with this huge gap in our mindset. Like, we can't be two things at once.
Mhm.
It's incongruent with who we are. And so we either fight against it or we will do whatever it takes ethically in order to get that gap reduced. And so if we go through before we put someone on a PIP, what if we actually asked them and had this goal setting exercise first? and then identified with them, all right, what are the specific things that you need to work on in order for you to get to this personal goal? And when I say personal goal, I mean things like I've worked with a lot of sales teams who are Latin American, and they wanted to send money back home to support their family or make enough money to bring their family over, or, support their grandmother in Alzheimer's care, or pay for their children's college, or take a vacation, or something along those lines. Heck, buy a sport car. I had one person tell me that they wanted to get a jet because their wife was afraid of flying unless they were the person flying.
Boy, that's a lot of sales.
That's a lot of
Uh,
sales.
That's a big ask.
But it's personally meaningful to them. And you might look at that at the outside and say, that's some materialistic thing. How can that be meaningful? It's not the thing. It's what the thing means. It's what the experience it creates.
That's a great point. Yeah, you're right. So it's but again, we go back to the confrontation. They kind of need to. It's almost on the manager to help them confront
Mm-hmm.
what they're doing wrong with sales too, or their
Yeah.
bad perception of it, and how that's creating the way that they sell.
Yeah. I mean, I guess what I'm basically saying is you can put someone on a performance improvement plan without even using the words.
Right.
hmm
Yeah.
Because what you're going to do is you're hoping with that improvement plan that you're going to put a plan together so they can improve. But as soon as you say those words, they're like, I'm a failure. I'm going to get fired. And it's to be able to get them to dig out from underneath that. I actually had another colleague of mine who was coaching someone who was on a PIP, and they were just about to make the number that they needed to get off their improvement plan. They had a week to go. And their manager came in and said, all right, so you've got a week to go. This is a big number that you're going to need to hit. I really hope you can do it. Burst his bubble. Like he was like fired up. He was like ready to go. And there's no way I'm going to do this.
Yeah. That's kind of a deflating Monday morning conversation. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
But somewhere on that manager's checklist was got to have this conversation with Fred.
Yeah.
Mhm. And that goes back to, of course, like you mentioned, the manager being a successful coach for that person.
Yeah.
Clearly, that manager probably wasn't in touch with their team or that particular person and didn't realize that maybe that would be such a trigger for them and probably shouldn't have been coaching them in that way to begin with.
It's not exactly coaching. But in the manager's defense, I mean, they're being pulled in so many different directions. And a lot of times sales managers are hired because they were the top sales rep
Oh, it happens all the time.
all
Yeah.
the time.
Mhm.
And it's a different skill set. As a salesperson, individually, you're focused on your results. That's your primary motivator. As a manager, you have to be focused on everyone else
hmm
and their results. And what happens a lot of times is the manager will be a top salesperson. They go into the role and just do what I do. And they'll take over for their salespeople. Then they start burning out. Then, they get stressed out. And then they walk into a performance improvement conversation and they drop that bomb that I just dropped. And so it's not necessarily the manager's fault if they haven't been trained on how to coach, if they haven't been set up for success. A couple of years ago, I did a roundtable with a group of female sales leaders. And I asked them, I said, what was the number one challenge for you going into sales leadership? And they all said overwhelmingly, and this was across all kinds of different industries and experience ranges, that when they went into sales management, all of the resources they had as a salesperson suddenly disappeared. Somehow, when they took on more responsibility, they got less support. And so the support that a sales manager needs to be able to spend, now the data shows that if you have a sales manager who is spending at least 50% of their time training and coaching their salespeople, and by coaching, I mean asking questions, getting into that skill development, what I call cognitive coaching, and helping them understand how their mindsets and beliefs are getting in the way. When managers do that, their sales teams have 49% more skills than managers who don't. I mean, imagine what a sales team could do with 49% more skills than they had the day before.
And I also think not only is that true for sales managers, but that's really true for managers in most
general.
departments.
Mhm.
Yeah, especially your point about training. A lot of times the managers in a company or in a department will be the one who's been there the longest or the best in that particular role, and that's how they move into that role.
The
It's
one with the
not-
most knowledge, too.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's
There's a
not
lot. Yeah.
necessarily that they exhibited better leadership skills.
Yeah.
So,
And I think one of the greatest assets that a manager can have, I was just having this conversation an hour ago with someone, is that when we were talking earlier about, does the person who writes the job description for whatever sales role, salesperson, sales manager, sales leader, account manager, customer success person, how well does that person understand the role? So if you have someone who's a salesperson who went to sales management, make sure you're involving them in how to write that job description and how to write that ad and what the criteria for success is, because they understand what it takes to be successful in that role. And so making sure that's a collaborative effort between HR and executive leadership and the sales hiring manager, and even the, top performing salespeople actually within that team, because that's someone who's going to have to sit next to that person every day. They know what it's going to take.
So we're talking about the difference, I think, a little bit between managers and leaders.
Hmm.
And I think it's interesting because, as you said, all the time we see business owners say, my top rep, they're doing great. They're the manager now.
Yeah.
Go and recruit salespeople, you train them, all that stuff. And so then you lose your top performing sales rep.
Yeah.
And you maybe have someone in management who just doesn't have the qualities that perhaps a top sales leader necessarily has. So talk a little bit about what you would say to that business owner instead of maybe going for, I'm promoting my top sales rep to a position to grow out my sales team.
Yeah.
What should they be looking for instead?
When I work with sales leaders and executive business owners to figure out who to hire as a sales manager, is we do essentially the same process that we do when we would hire a salesperson. So what is, the questions of what's the environment of the organization? How do you want them spending their time? How do you want them to train their people? Is it something you're going to outsource? Is it something you expect them to have that knowledge to do? How much of their time is going to be spent coaching? How strong of a coach do you think that they're going to need to be given the market, the buyer, the level of competition, the price ranges of your products and services and the average length of that particular sales cycle? Does that manager think in terms of volume or do they think in terms of profitability? Because, all of these types of management and leadership questions, you need to, one, make sure that manager is in alignment with you as a leader and where and how they're going to sell in that organization, but then also how they're going to best use their time in developing their team. Do you expect this manager to coach and develop the team, or do you expect them to, simply run spreadsheets all of the time? So you have to make sure that it's going to be the right fit for the manager and the type of team that they're going to be working with so that they can then create those environments that sellers can become buyer first. And so when it's alignment between leadership as well as the market and as well as the team that they're going to be selling. And then, what are the sales skills that are so critical in your sales process that this manager needs to be able to be strong in? Because if you struggle with, say, for example, in what we call a non-supportive buy cycle, like how you buy is how you sell. So if you're someone who needs to shop around and you have to get the best price for something, but you're selling a high ticket volume item, that's going to be in conflict. You're going to struggle with being able to do that because of your own buying mindset. And then that's going to infect the team as well. And it's going to cause them to struggle. And you're not going to be able to, as a manager, coach them out of it because it's a weakness for you. So where the strengths and weaknesses of that manager need to line up with the type of sale that you have, who you're selling to, and how they're going to need to coach and develop that team. And using an assessment that is not just personality based or behavioral based, but is actually also skill based, combined all of those together with cognitive so that it's specific to that particular role. And that you can then look at that and say, this is someone who's most likely to be successful going through your interview process. And they're going to then be able to go in and actually do the things that you need them to do. Because this is the other part of it, is sales leaders and sales managers, they interview really well.
Yeah.
If they
That's
can't
true.
sell you
They're
in the
gonna sell
job interview,
themselves.
then there's
Yeah.
a problem.
I want to talk a little bit more about later on in our conversation about how you buy is how you sell, because that part in your book was so interesting to me because I was like, oh man, is that me? But no.
I felt really called out on.
Yeah, exactly. I think everybody would, though.
Yeah,
Carole, let's get a little bit into your background, because you talk about in your book and in your other endeavors too, your entrepreneurial DNA, which
Yeah.
I loved the anecdote about when you were talking about grandmother Mahoney and how you, from a very young age, were brought to these networking events with
Yeah.
your real estate business owner grandmother.
Yeah.
And how you knew from, the age of whatever, I don't
I
know
think it
how-
was 9.
Yeah, maybe. But you said, I knew how to introduce myself in a professional setting. You were basically part of the networking event, which I
Yeah.
think is so cool because, I just, as an aside, I love like when kids are, it's great to have kids exposed to positive business experiences because there's almost like this osmosis
Yeah.
effect, which you kind of touch on happened with you a little bit. So my question is, do you think you'd be where you are today without going to those places with grandmother Mahoney and getting that kind of sales osmosis, if you will?
Probably not. And she would be just tickled in her grave right now to hear all of that because, and she really was my first business and sales mentor. And not that she was always the most successful person, but that's another story. But yeah, she, just put it this way, and I can say this because all of my family members who would be upset about this wouldn't hear it anyway. She had, an abusive husband, and she had to figure out a way to support herself and her young children. And, this was the 1950s and 60s when she
Mhm.
started to have to confront these things. And, she bucked every trend that there was. She did not care how many people told her she couldn't do something. She would do it anyway, and she would find a way. And that was the part of her that I always looked up to. Like, she did not care what other people thought.
Mm-hmm.
She was going to do whatever it took. And she held herself and everyone else around her to an almost impossibly high standard. And the thing of it was, is that, and she was the one who taught me how to introduce myself at networking events and how to balance the books, which was a disaster, by the way. Even things like how to comport yourself at a dinner and where you put your knife and your fork and, how you sit up straight and things like that, because people's first impressions of you are their lasting impression of you. And that you need to be proud of who you are and what it is that you do and the value that you bring to the world. I mean, this is a woman from like her and Ruth Gator Binsberg would have been like best buddies, I think. And it was just something that she had always instilled in me. She's, if you want something, then you get it. You do whatever you have to do to get it. And don't let anyone tell you that you can't. So yeah, that's Grandma Mahoney.
Yeah, that's great. But it's funny too that you're talking about the way you learned how to interact with
Yeah.
so many people with her, because that is a thing when it's almost like how you want your kids to take language
Mhm.
from or learn a foreign language from a very young age, because their brains are like sponges and you
Yeah.
can just absorb all that stuff around you.
Oh, it was definitely a foreign language.
Yeah. So we've got your book here. Let's talk a little bit about the book, the title, Buyer First. Oh, and here we are with How You Buy is How You Sell, because that's a huge piece
Yeah.
of your book. So as we were saying, like I was thinking about myself, I exhaustively research everything when I buy something.
Yep.
And when you said that, if you're an exhaustive researcher, or if you haggle on price, or if you never actually make a decision, I think you said people will put it in their shopping cart online and never actually check out.
It'll be there for a year.
Yeah.
And then you keep getting those emails like you left something behind.
Yeah.
Yeah. You're waiting for that discount code to come through is what it is.
So let's talk a little bit about that, because it's a great insight, because it helps people with self-awareness and say, oh, you know what? Maybe I'm doing that and I'm pushing that off on my buyers. Or as you say, you're going to be more accepting of people who do it to you.
Yeah. And I guess that's kind of the crazy thing of all of this, is that a lot of the complaints that we have of the buyers' behaviors, they ghost us, they don't give us information, they're always haggling on price and asking for discounts and delaying their decisions. The very things that we're complaining about, we're often the ones causing it. Just like I said before, a lot of times that companies who bring me in to help work on their sales teams, they don't realize that they're the ones causing it, right? Like, we don't know what we don't know. We're inside the bottle of ourselves or our organizations. And sometimes we do need that outside perspective to say, have you thought about it this way? Have you ever considered that maybe, or could it be? Right. And a lot of times what's happened is, we've talked about a couple of different mindsets and they all interact with each other. It's not like one is the answer to all of these things.
Mhm.
We're dynamic human beings. We're all a little bit of everything. But 73% of professional salespeople today struggle with a non-supportive buy cycle. So they are more susceptible to people who want to kick the tires, who want to think it over, who want to have the best price. And because they buy that way, they won't push back. They won't ask the questions. And they also won't ask the questions that help their buyers to answer their own questions about how to make this decision. Like we were talking about before, we're asking questions to get the information that we want. We're not always asking the questions that get our buyers the information they need to feel comfortable and confident in making this decision. Because at the end of the day, we just want someone sometimes to just tell us that we trust that this is the right decision. I would do that if I were you. Because we fear making a wrong decision, or we fear making a decision that's not going to make a difference. And so we don't do anything. And so when that happens and we have a non-supportive buy cycle, we think, oh, you need to think it over? That's okay. Because if you think it over, you'll eventually buy from me. We don't ask the questions that help our buyers answer their questions.
Mm-hmm.
And I also thought that was another thing in your book that was really interesting about building that trust.
Mm.
And so I know you probably are dying to talk about those dopamine hits. So go for it.
Well, I mean, my dopamine is flooding right now because I know I'm doing all of the talking. And that's so the interesting thing about dopamine, and this is also one of the reasons why I've started studying neuroscience and its application to business, is when we do things like we do all of the talking, what happens is it lights up our brains with dopamine because we love to share our thoughts and opinions on things. There was this study that was done out of Harvard, and they wanted to understand why people just can't shut up about themselves, basically, is what it comes down to. And so they hooked them up to this brain scanning technology. And they started asking them to state their opinions on things, asking them questions that would get them to expound on what they thought about a particular situation or just go off on a tangent. And it lit up the part of their brain where dopamine is released. And dopamine is that feel good chemical, right? It reinforces certain behaviors. It's why, there's good behaviors and bad behaviors in dopamine. Like you get dopamine when you have, sitting down and having a good meal with people or listening to music or dancing or singing or, all of these kinds of things like exercise, like that releases dopamine in our brains. And so that's a good side of dopamine when it reinforces good habits. But there is also, like anything, there's a side to that coin where it's bad. A lot of drug addictions and alcohol abuse happens because of dopamine, because we want more and more of it. So we keep doing that thing that gives us that dopamine, but it's a bad habit. It doesn't actually help us and serve us well. Or, I'm guilty of this where I've got my phone in my hand and my husband's trying to have a conversation with me and I have no idea that he's even talking to me, right? Because I'm on Facebook or Instagram or checking email, all of these little things that we do that maybe aren't actually productive,
I
but they
think I
give us
even
these
saw a
dopamine.
thing that the little red icon that says, "Oh, it's a new message."
Yeah.
That's a dopamine hit. Just seeing
Yeah.
that, and they know that. That's
Yeah.
why it's all over the
All the
place.
little dings that we get on our computers,
Mhm.
things like that, releases that dopamine that then distracts us to, like in gaming even, right? Like gaming and in music, they're intentionally designing all of those little dopamine hits throughout the game so that you stay in the game to keep playing
I
it.
know, isn't that scary?
It's amazingly,
insane.
but also it's scary. It's like all things. You can use it for good or you can use it for evil, right?
Exactly. Right.
And so dopamine, when we do stating our opinions, it's why it's so hard sometimes to get salespeople to just shut the hell up.
Mhm.
And why you encounter that person at the dinner table who just won't stop talking long enough for you to be able to interrupt and say, I want to go talk to so and that's what happens with salespeople, especially when they're under pressure and they need to make a quota
Mhm.
and they're feeling like I need to get this person to buy. And the more I tell them about it, I used to have this belief that the more passion I had about what I was talking about, it was going to come through and they were going to intentionally buy. I was just addicted to that own dopamine in my own head. So what I like to say to people is you need to pass around the dopamine, man. Don't hog it all. You need to let your
Yeah.
buyers have the dopamine, asking them those open-ended questions. And so giving your buyers a dopamine hit means that you're intentionally, again, asking those questions, those open-ended questions, not yes or no, but who, what, when, where, why, to understand what's going on in their mind, to get them to share what it is that they think is going on, because they've been thinking about this a lot longer than they've been talking to you. They've been doing their research. They've come to some kind of a conclusion already. Your job is to understand what that is, and having them share that with you helps you to understand them. But because that dopamine is being released in their head, Stanford studies show that when that happens, they also start to change their minds. You ever had that conversation with someone where they come to you with a problem and you ask one or two questions and they've talked for 20 minutes and by the end solve their own problem?
Yeah.
That's exactly it.
I feel like I'm actually more on the other end of that, but yeah, I don't.
You talk about that in your book too, the questions and periods
The
game,
questions
right?
and periods
Yes.
game, yes. That was one of my first sales coaches and mentors had this game that he would play with all of his coachees, and I turned it into a New Year's Eve drinking game. And what we would do, the whole premise of the game is that you ask, 20 questions when you
Yeah.
have 20 questions to figure out what's going on. This is, you start to learn a lot more about people when you can only answer in questions. And so in order to shut up, I had to get better at asking questions. And so just start asking these opening questions of everybody around me. So I would play the questions and periods game anytime. Tim, this morning, the driver, we had 2 hours together. I was practicing the whole way, man. And
That's
so
great.
by practicing it, so the whole premise of the game is if someone asks you a question, you have to ask a clarifying question in return. It has to be related to the question that was asked. It can't be, so how do you think of the weather is today? You can't say, what do you want for dinner?
Right.
Like it has to be in relation to that other question.
Okay. Yep.
So that way, the person who then ends the game is the one who answers with a period. And then in the drinking game, that's when you had to take a shot.
That reminds me of something I think this is on another podcast I was listening to, but they were talking about the best way to have a conversation. And obviously that's what sales is conversations.
Right.
But tell me what you think about this. They were talking about identifying if somebody's an introvert or an extrovert,
Mm-hmm.
and then asking either open-ended or more specific questions, depending. I think they said specific questions were better for introverts.
Hmm.
The open-ended were better for extroverts because they were like, I can talk about anything. Just let's go.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. And that's interesting. I want to check that out because what I can imagine is that, and we all adjust how we ask our questions based on the person that we're talking to,
Mhm.
right? That's one of the things that I try to say in the book is that this is just a starting point for you to then customize and target these questions based on the individual that you're talking to. One of my favorite tools is DISC, and that's how I like to customize my questions. So it's based on sometimes whether or not we're an introvert or an extrovert always isn't always the major factor in how they make their business decisions.
Interesting.
Because introvert extrovert is how you like to act and be in a social situation. But just like with sales, how you act in a social situation when you're hanging out with your friends at the bar or meeting new people at the bar is different than how you're talking with someone in a sales context. And so I can see how in a social context that would definitely apply, but in a business context, I like to rely more on DISC because it tells me the type of communication style that they have in this particular moment, right? Like a lot of times, if you're dealing with someone like me who's an entrepreneur or CEO or a business owner, I'm a huge D. And so as a high
But wait,
D,
so what is DISC?
DISC is a communication style assessment that helps people to understand both what their own communication style is, whether you're someone who's a D who is dominant and you're very much faced on making quick decisions. You're focused kind of on the pros and benefits and ROI of things. You're very direct about how you
Mhm.
talk about. You need to keep things short and to the point. Don't dig into all of the details with them in a conversation because they're going to tune you out.
Got it.
And so those different styles and how they like to communicate is how I like to then look at how am I going to phrase my questions to this person. For someone who's very direct, I can be very short and blunt and to the point. But someone who's, say, very an S or a C, who's much more specific, and I'm going to want to use more details in my question when I ask them that, it needs to be much more targeted and specific to what they're thinking. Because if I ask them a generalized open question, they're going to be like, what do you mean?
Yeah. I'm gonna look that up. But do you feel like you've been doing this long enough that you can confidently identify somebody kind of mid conversation, right? Say, you know what, I'm starting to pick up some cues. This person, I need to modify the way I'm speaking with them a little bit.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know if it's a conscious thing anymore.
Right.
I will say
Yeah.
this, when I first, started working on my own sales skill sets, right? Like beyond just learning how to introduce myself at a networking meeting at 9 years old. And I suppose I started learning it then, right?
Mhm.
But for me, what I did is I'm such a nerd. I had this little 4x4, laminated card that had all of the DISC personality styles on them with the bullet points of how to identify them. And when I would, they're going to
That's
laugh.
great.
I went to, whenever I would go to a networking event, before I went in, I would brief myself on it, right? I would review it. And then when I went in to talk to someone, I would test it out on the people that I was talking to. And then I would go into the restroom, review it again. I'm like, okay, I'm going to go back and ask them this question.
They're like, this is a whole new person. Is this who I was just talking to?
And the thing is, I shared this once at a networking event and someone, isn't that disingenuous? Aren't you not being who you are? Aren't you just trying to like manipulate people? I'm like, okay, first of all, in order for me to be able to relate to someone, I want to make sure that I understand them and they understand me, which means we need to find what is our common language. It's not
Mhm.
like I'm suddenly changing who I am. I'm not suddenly going to be, this stiff upper lip person if that's not who I am.
Right.
But I'm going to adjust my style so that the other person feels more comfortable and we can relate on some type of a common ground. It's not like I'm trying to, again, good or evil. You're the one with the intention who decides how you use it.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, really, you're being courteous toward the other person
Right.
Yeah.
because they, like we're talking about, I mean, a certain method of communicating might almost be offensive to them. So let's modify, not imitate, not
Yeah.
be disingenuous, as you said, but modify it a little bit
Even
so
when
they're
you're
more
dealing
comfortable.
with other cultures, whether that's
Right.
locally or internationally, like how you would interact with someone from Japan is
Hmm.
probably not how you're going to interact with someone from Texas.
Exactly. Yeah. We're a technology company.
Yep.
We're surrounded by cameras and audio and all the stuff. It's inescapable, but it's very inescapable from a sales perspective. The
Yeah.
amount of sales tech that is available and pushed on us and this is going to solve this problem and build your pipeline and all that. I read an article in Forbes recently which said basically we've got sales leaders who they're getting all this tech for their teams
Mhm.
and they're not making them more effective
They know less.
sellers. They're making them more effective spammers.
Yeah.
And I thought that is totally true because I mean, we get like dozens of the cold emails and you can tell like it blasts it out to everybody.
Yeah.
The LinkedIn messages, like it's nonstop. So first of all, I mean, how do salespeople kind of cut through this? Because it seems like the more technology and the more avenues that they can reach people with this technology, the more they get tuned out.
Yeah. They're getting tuned out because they're using generic messages that are being spammed. There was a LinkedIn study that showed that 90% of executives ignore irrelevant and spammy messages. And my reaction was, who's the 10% that don't?
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
But that's what they focus on. They focus on the 10% that don't. And so they spam everybody in the world to find the 10% that won't do that. And meanwhile, it's a race to the bottom. And now you've got AI thrown into all of this. So now they can do even more, even faster.
Right.
And AI is only as good as the person training it, like any tool. And we've just become a way to just scale more crap. And I think that what I train and coach my sellers to do and my managers to do is less is more, quantity over quality. I'm sorry, quality over quantity. I like in an example that I put in the book was a BDR who I was working with, whose company will remain nameless. And they were just sending out all of the automated sequences and workflows or whatever the phrases of the day of sending more than anyone else, spending all of his time on a Slack channel to figure out what's the latest hack and the latest tweak, or scrolling through LinkedIn to follow the, next latest and greatest influencer. And this is going to give you a 68% increase in your open rate and your meeting booked rate. And this is one that I love, where you email someone over and over again and they ignore you. So you send them a calendar invite.
I've gotten those.
Yeah.
And what's your reaction?
Yeah, exactly.
oh, that's
well,
pretty bold.
it's very presumptuous. Yeah.
Yeah. Do you go to those meetings?
No way.
Yeah. Okay. And so
Well, maybe if they're giving me a gift card. No, I don't go. I still log on.
now you're going to be getting all of those.
That's the other thing,
Yeah.
though.
Yeah.
The gift cards or the Yetis. How many? Well, we give away Yetis, but no, I don't want a Yeti with my name on. Everybody's. You want a Yeti with your name on it for a meeting? Not really, actually.
Yeah.
I don't think I do want a Yeti with
What's
my
the
name.
value of that meeting?
I'm fine with just the.
Yeah.
I like my logo on it.
Yeah.
Now.
Yeah.
And I'll say this: if it's working for you, ignore everything I say.
It's true. Yeah, that's true. You got to. If it's working, then and it's.
But how long is it going to work
Genuine.
for? Right?
Yeah.
It's like I first started my career in marketing and SEO before they knew how to spell SEO and pay-per-click. And as I'm looking at it in my mind is, okay, this is a new way for us to eliminate sales, because I hated sales still at the time, and go directly to the buyer. They can find exactly what they need. They don't need to deal with a pushy salesperson. And then all of the agencies and media companies just started using it like they use any advertising platform. You want to take a good idea and kill it, give it to a marketer.
That's great.
Sorry, Jamie. I am a marketer too. But and the same thing with salespeople. You want to take a good technology that could further a human connection and help you to relate to people better, and leave it to a salesperson who's under pressure to just spam everybody on their list. And so by taking the time, and so technology, I feel, should be used not to scale crap, but to do deeper research on your buyers, to understand more about them, to practice and role play the conversations that you're going to need to have with them. One of my friends, Stephanie Boyer, has a company called Rainmaker, where they're creating AI bots to help people get enough reps in so that they can actually have better conversations. And a lot of sales coaches and trainers will see this as a threat. And I'm like, you know how much time that's going to save me when I don't have to keep repeating myself over and over again? And that when I meet with that individual who's put the reps in, can then really coach them on the fine points of how to do this with a human being once they've got the basic practice skill in place, right? If you're learning how to play piano, what's the first thing they teach you to do? The scales, right? And you have to repeat that over and over again until it becomes muscle memory. And then when you start learning complicated pieces with all of the ins and outs and things of it, because you have that muscle memory, it's easier for you to do. That's how I see AI. That's how I see the technology today, is that if you can accelerate the understanding of the human being that you need to talk to and the research that you do, and making it easier for salespeople to get that research in a meaningful way that they can take, instead of 3 hours to research a company and a prospect, 15 minutes with relevant information that they're double checking to make sure it's true. And then, using that information to, like, I use a tool to identify people's disc profiles online so that I can customize my messaging to them. Instead of the old way is that I would go through their LinkedIn profiles and a couple of others and try to deduce it for myself, which took a whole bunch more time.
Yeah.
So there's ways that we can use technology to further a better human connection, which is what people need and want today. Like, everyone's talking about how AI is going to replace salespeople, just like they said the internet was going to replace salespeople. And yes, it did replace certain types of sales jobs that are very transactional that you don't need a human being for. You know what? I don't necessarily need a human being to buy a hairdryer, But I do need a human being to help me figure out how am I going to create HR and payroll for my company and my employees. Like, I can't just go through a robot for that. And so I think using the technology to make a better connection with our buyers is the way that it needs to go. Making it easier for salespeople to enter information into CRMs without having to spend all of their time behind a spreadsheet typing things in, so that they can spend more times being in front of their buyers and having networking conversations. Like, that should be the intention of the technology, not to replace, but to enhance.
Did we talk about everything with HR and sales? You
Um,
had some. You had some.
yeah, yeah, I had a few more, especially you said you just came back from an HR type conference,
Yeah.
right? So this will be great for that.
And it literally was on the top of our mind that we've been talking about over the last couple of days. And I'm talking with an HR person right after this too. So
Perfect.
yeah.
So one thing I think about with HR, and I say to everybody here is I always tell them like, no, I'm selling the company too. I'm selling
Mhm.
the company just as much as our sales team is. It's just from a totally different perspective.
Absolutely.
But sometimes I have to sell the not so fun jobs, the not as glamorous jobs.
Mhm.
So what advice do you have for people either in sales or in HR when they're selling those not as glamorous jobs or things?
What's an example of a not glamorous job? BDR, business development rep, you
right.
have to make cold calls all day long.
Yeah.
Okay.
I was thinking more like if you're like at a cashier or something. I mean, that's probably not a fun job to have to try to sell, but yeah, sure. We can use that as our
Yeah, so like
example.
an entry level job where it's, maybe not the funnest part of the thing. It's interesting too, like when we use the assessments to hire salespeople, right? Like it takes sometimes 30 to 45 minutes for someone to take an assessment. And as a candidate, you kind of have to sell them on the idea of doing that. And it's really about what I do is to try to portray to them what's in it for them in the future. You need to take this entry level job, but what's in it for you is that you're going to learn the skills to be able to advance to X, Y, and Z in a certain amount of time down the road. And that experience is going to be able to help you to understand how to handle these types of situations if that's a career path that you want to go down. And so it's not about selling the job to them. It's about really understanding what is it in for them, just like with our buyers and collaborating with them of, what interests you in working with this company? Where is it that you would ultimately like to see yourself in this company? And then laying it out as this is a stepping stone and a path in order for them to get there. So it's not about selling them on the glories of being a cashier or the glories of being a business development and say, look, this first role is going to be really tough. You're going to have to deal with people who are upset, or you're going to have to deal with people who don't want to talk to you. But the bonus of that is that if you can learn from that, then this is going to help you later on in the goal and the path that you've described. When I'm talking with HR professionals and telling them that, it's going to take 45 minutes for a candidate to take this assessment, and they're like, "Oh, I don't know if they're gonna wanna do that." And I say, "Okay, number 1, if they're not willing to take 45 minutes to answer a questionnaire, how likely is it do you think that they're gonna wanna learn about
Absolutely.
your company?
Right.
How dedicated and committed are they?" Number 1. But then number 2, positioning it with them is that this is not just us seeing if you're a good fit, but also if we're a good fit for you. Because there may be certain parts of this role and aspect that you're not comfortable with, and wouldn't you rather know those things now than when you're being onboarded later on and you've said no to another offer
Mhm.
that might be a better fit? And when you take this assessment and we hire you, we're going to give you a copy of that report for your own professional development to work with your manager on so that you can also advance within the company and start and enjoy this job. And because, I mean, we all don't want to just be put in a role and stuck there. We all want to be able to grow and know that we are going to have a bigger impact later on. And so it's being able to understand, right, what's really in it for them. Where do they want to end up?
And it's interesting you say that too about the fit and whether the person wants the role, and they tell you beforehand instead of
Hmm.
saying after, oh, this isn't a fit. I actually had an interview a few weeks ago, and it was the first time this ever happened to me. After the interview, it was just a phone interview.
Hmm.
The candidate said to me, okay, I'll get back to you in a couple days and let you know if I still want this job. And I was so shocked by it because nobody had ever said that to me. But thinking of my buying process is I like to add things to my cart and not check out. And I was like, maybe, and as you were talking, I'm like, maybe that's why that bothered me so much because that's exactly the way I think about things.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it was just really interesting that a candidate actually said that. But in hindsight, they did end up saying that they didn't think the job was for them,
Hmm.
which is better than them onboarding and it not working out. Another thing that I thought would be interesting for HR professionals in your book is when you talked about that questions and periods game. What are some other practical ways that you think or you've seen business leaders and HR leaders maybe use that in their day to day?
Oh, you can use it on anybody around you. Like when I first started doing this questions and periods game, it was between me and my husband after dinner. And have you ever had this situation where they come home, you're having a glass of wine or a specialty vodka and you sit down to start telling you about their day and you start telling them, well, you should try this, you should do that, you should do this particular thing. And then they get mad at you and it turns into an argument.
Yeah.
more often than not.
Or even worse, oh, why don't you just do it? That's like the easiest answer ever.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Thanks. I haven't been struggling over this for
Yeah.
months and years. And so I would do that with my husband, and he'd get mad at me. He's like, you don't understand what it's like there. You don't know what this person's is like and how long this has been going on. That'll never work there. This isn't one of your warm kumbaya corporate retreats where everybody's going to sit around and hold hands. This is a XYZ implementation. And I'm like, all right. And then I would get mad at him because he's not listening to me. He's not valuing my advice. I'm a freaking management consultant guy. This is what I do every day, right? And now you're not listening to me. And now you're going to get fired from your job because you're telling your boss off. And it's sure turned into this whole thing. And so when I shut up and just started him asking them, like playing the questions and periods game with him, and he didn't know I was doing it. That's the key part, is that you have to do it in a way that people don't realize you're doing it, because that's how you can actually, that's when you know you're in the present moment. You're asking really good questions and they're revealing stuff to you and they're loving you because you're asking them such great questions that get them to think about things differently. And that's what would happen with Steve, is when he came home and he sat down and we had our glass of whatever, and I would ask him questions like, how did your day go today? And he'd start complaining about something. I was like, why do you think they did that? Or why do you think they reacted that way? And how long has that been going on for? And what would you do if you thought, you could say something to them? What would you say? And all of a sudden he starts coming to the same conclusions that I would have told him, except it was his idea. And so you can use this in any situation, with your kids, with your coworkers, with your managers, with your, Uber drivers, if you want to. I just will warn you that you might start getting people's life stories like in the middle of the grocery store.
Yeah. Finally, somebody asked me. That's what they're thinking.
Yes.
I've
I've
wanted
gotten
to say
quite-
that for years.
I've gotten quite a few life stories in interviews.
Exactly. Right.
I just wanted to say that when I said that, oh yeah, why don't you just do it? It's so easy. I was imitating myself. My wife is the best questions listening person ever. I'm the horrible one.
Is she in sales? She should be.
No, she's not. But yeah, she probably would be great at it.
Mm-hmm.
But
Well,
she's
she's
not
got to
interested in that.
negotiate with all the children.
I know.
Oh,
That's
my
true.
goodness.
She's a nurse.
Ah,
Which, I mean, like you say, everybody has to sell, right?
she's
Nurse-
selling behavior
yeah,
change.
Yeah. You talked about in your book how, I mean, the statistics are crazy. So many salespeople fail. And what are the statistics for businesses too? Like new businesses, just the numbers are
The
are
average
shocking.
business owner makes less than $49,000 a year.
Yeah, and it's funny because people glamorize the entrepreneur lifestyle and they think they're going to be millionaires overnight too.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's not. It's a tough racket.
Yeah. The number of six-figure businesses, the number of women-owned six-figure businesses it might be in the double digits now, but it was pretty relatively small.
Mhm. But one of the anecdotes that I thought was interesting when you're talking about the fail rate for salespeople, and you were talking about this guy who literally did everything. He did the research, he had the tools, he researched the latest tactics and tips and had everything laid out. And the one thing that he wouldn't do was get on the phone and call people.
Right.
And I think you said you got to call, you got to talk to somebody, you
Yeah.
got to try to make the sale. I thought that was, when I was thinking that, I thought, how important is it? And especially from your perspective, working with all these salespeople, to just say, you know what, at the end of the day, you can take all this, you can read my book and every book and anything. You gotta get out there. You have to, pound the pavement, literally or figuratively.
Yep.
Knock on doors, literally or figuratively, which still can sometimes work, knocking on doors. But just get out there and sell.
Yeah. I look at it this way. It's a lot of times people do all of this extensive research and planning because they have this perfectionism, right? I've got to get it exactly right. I've only got one shot at this. If this doesn't go well, I'm screwed forever. And we get into this closed-minded perfectionist mindset that if we just do it the perfect way, then everything's going to fall into place. And it's just not how life works, right? Like even in science, you can come up with a hypothesis and you do the research and you test an experiment, but the end part of the scientific process is reiteration. And so if you look at prospecting not as getting it perfectly right, but at least getting it out there and testing it out. Dharmeshar, who's one of the co-founders of HubSpot, I'm a huge fan of his. And he's famous for saying, don't make it perfect, put it out there and let your customers perfect it. And prospecting sales works a lot in the same way. Like one of the things that I try to portray in the book is to take all of this and start forming your own experiments with it. Take the foundations and the basic benchmarks that I've given you and apply it to your own situations and start coming up with not the perfect script or the perfect landing page or the perfect this, that, or the next thing or the latest hack, but come up with something that you can test, something that you can experiment with, and that you can then get feedback and keep iterating and documenting and iterating and documenting until you get a full understanding and start to see how it's playing out. I've been doing that for 20 plus years. It's a constant testing and reiteration. And you have to constantly test and reiterate because things change so quickly. What worked yesterday might not work tomorrow.
That's a great closing message for us to wrap that up. But Carole, I wanted to review too where people can find you, because obviously LinkedIn, website, and all that stuff. But you're a speaker at HubSpot's big conference in September, Inbound 24, which is great. So tell us a little bit about what people can expect from you and where they can find you.
Yeah. So this is the 9th year I've been speaking at Inbound, so I'm pretty excited for this year. So I'm a featured speaker. My name's next to Ryan Reynolds and Sienna Williams. I'm like,
pretty sweet. Yeah.
Pretty sweet. So I'm doing a couple of sessions. One is going to be on this dopamine hit, right? How do we give our buyers a dopamine hit? How do we resist our own urges to hog all of the dopamine? And what does that sound like? What does that look like? And I actually want this to be kind of a workshop style with people where we're going to actually brainstorm questions. I may even try and get a few people up on stage to start role-playing some conversations with me in the questions and periods game.
Oh, talk about a sales interview.
Yeah, exactly. So we're going to have a lot of fun with that. But then we're also going to be doing a meetup. Lori Richardson and I are teaming up to talk with sales leaders and CROs about, what's coming in 2025. How do you need to prepare your teams? What are you seeing happening? What are some of the revenue strategies that are proven to work? Not the latest fly-by-the-night hack, not the latest, AI thing that you're going to implement into your organization, but what are the things that you need to be training and developing your people on to have the conversations in the next year in order to not just, again, keep up with the trends, but maybe start setting some of those trends. Mm-hmm. So I'm super excited for that. And I'm hoping that we'll have a third session. I don't want to give it away because it hasn't come through yet, but we're working on another big one as well.
Well, sounds great. Sounds like a can't miss session. And obviously the conference is set to attract like 10,000 plus attendees. So it's going to be a big thing, but you don't seem like you have stage fright. So that's good.
Not anymore.
Yeah.
I used to. Yeah. I used to have debilitating stage fright. Like if you were to listen to like my 2015 Inbound session, I think it's on YouTube somewhere still. There's parts where I sound like Minnie Mouse.
Oh, really? That's so funny though, because I went to school with this kid who had crippling stage fright also. Mm-hmm. And he ended up being class president senior year because he like did all these like classes and was like, I am going to get past this. I can't live like this.
Yeah. And that's what you do. Like your biggest weakness sometimes becomes the thing you become an expert in because you're so determined to figure it out for yourself.
Overcome it.
Yeah, that's awesome. And obviously you're very active on LinkedIn. Your website is CaroleMahoney.com.
Yep. So CaroleMahoney.com is my speaker site. It's also where you'll be able to order the book. And if you order the book this year, everyone, I am doing a monthly sort of buyer book club Q&A. So if you're reading the book and you've got a question, we have people come in and we're role-playing out scenarios with them on these conversations. So that's once a month for free, 30 minutes. So just, when you look at that order form on the page, scroll down to the bottom, you'll see the sign-up list for that. And my corporate training and coaching website is unboundgrowth.com because I believe that anybody can learn sales and have unbound growth.
That's excellent. So we'll have links to all that stuff in the show notes.
Awesome.
Well, thank you, Carole Mahoney. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me, both of you. That's awesome.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Checkwriters. Be sure to follow us on Apple, YouTube, or wherever you view your favorite podcasts. Stay tuned for future episodes where we'll continue to uncover the secrets behind successful organizations.